start this series by talking about my favorite collection, obsession, dice. I have a reason for having this many. I could have more. And always have more dice. So how do these little bad boys play into D&D? How do they become the obsession that everyone loses themselves to? Is this too much? Is there a thing as too much? So D&D functions via the Dungeon Master describing a scenario, the players describing an action they want to take in that scenario, and then the DM describing the consequences of that action. But how does the DM determine the consequences of that action? Depending on the type of action, the DM might just decide. But if there's the potential for failure or success, well, that is where we use these bad boys. They go by many names. Polyhedral dice sets, math rocks, the obsession that's slowly financially destroying me because I can't stop buying more. Anyway, these dice are the basics of the actual mechanical rules of D&D. You know, what makes it a game rather than just a role-playing experience. They're used to determine pretty much anything that can be determined by chance. How much health you have, how much damage you just took, if you survive bleeding out on the ground after how much damage you just took. Basically, if it can be dice, it's dice. It's kind of the charm of D&D because so much is determined by the hand of fate. Not even the DM knows exactly what's going to happen. No two sessions are exactly alike. It allows the game to have tension and for the story to have a life of its own that you discover as you play. So what are all the dice that make this magical thing happen? Because if you hadn't noticed, we're a bit beyond the normal 6-sided dice that everyone's used to. Well, instead of just a 6-sided dice, we have dice with 4 sides, 6 sides, 8 sides, 10, 12, 20. It's a lot, I know, but like most things with D&D, it's simpler than it seems. For simplicity's sake, these dice are usually referred to by D however many sides they have. So your run-of-the-mill 6-sided dice would be called a D6. With all that established, let's talk about the head honcho dice king to rule them all, the D20. The cornerstone of pretty much the entire game, the D20 determines if anything really succeeds or fails. Jumping out of the way of a trap, swinging your sword at an enemy, or charming information out of the local barkeep, these are all determined by the D20. Typically, in that role, higher is better. That is because D&D functions off of the principle of difficulty classes, a term I will mostly be using the abbreviation for DC. Turns out D&D players hate words and will shorten them at any opportunity. A DC is basically the number you have to hit or surpass in a roll to succeed. If you roll anything under it, you fail. The higher the DC, the more difficult it is. There's only so many numbers on a D20, so it becomes more difficult to roll that number or above. But depending on what you roll, sometimes you have additional numbers you can add on top of it to make it easier to hit higher numbers. These additional numbers are called modifiers. They are something we will talk about in more detail in future videos where we talk about ability scores and skills and proficiencies and all of that. Another feature of the D20 roll is that sometimes you can roll it at advantage or disadvantage. Basically, this means that you roll the D20 twice. If you're an advantage, you take the higher of the two numbers. Remember, higher is better. If at disadvantage, you take the lower of the two numbers. Here's a quick little example of how that works. Let's say I'm fighting someone and I want to hit him with my mace. That would be a normal roll. If, say, that enemy just threw sand in my face and now I'm trying to blindly swing and hit where I think he is, that would be disadvantage because it's harder than it normally is. If I'm the one that just blinded my enemy with sand and he can't see where to dodge the incoming mace, then that would be an advantage because it's gonna be easier to bonk him. If we somehow both blind each other at the same time, then it's actually a normal roll. Advantages and disadvantages cancel each other out. This principle doesn't care how many of either you have. One disadvantage will cancel out any number of advantages. They don't stack. Now that we've covered the basics of the D20, let's move on to the other ones. Where the D20 is typically considered like the hand of fate dice, the other ones are more of the nitty-gritty rules of D&D. These dice, the D4, the D6, the D8, the D10, the D12, they all tend to serve the same purpose, just at different levels. Let me give you some examples. How much damage you do with a dagger when you hit with an attack is determined by a D4. Tiny blade, tiny dice. The damage of a short sword, however, is a d6. Slightly bigger blade, slightly bigger dice. The same concept pretty much applies to anywhere these dice are used in the game. For a greater magnitude, either more or a greater dice is used. Sometimes this sliding scale even includes a d20. Stronger spells use bigger or more dice to determine the damage. Beefier player classes use bigger dice to determine their health. If you get a rock thrown at you, you'll probably take a d4 of damage. If a giant throws a boulder at you, you're probably gonna take some d12s. You can almost view all of these dice as a singular category of magnitude rather than the individuality of a d20. There is one more die that I haven't mentioned, and that's because it's rarely used in common play, the d100. Yes, there is a dice with 100 sides. Yes, it looks like a golf ball and it rolls off the table every time you try to roll it. Most people just use 2 d10s, or one for the tens place, one for the ones place. The d100, also called the percentile dice, has very little written rules for it. Usually their use is left up to DM preference. They work similarly to the d20, where the DC is the percentage of how likely something might happen. With percentages, you want to roll the percentage or lower. I personally have used them as dice of magnitude as well. The higher the number, the greater the magnitude. Like, say, an explosion that my player then rolled 100 on. Good times. Well, that's dice. This will be the first actual video of this channel, so I have a special request. D&D is a game of community, and it's also a game of stories, so I want to hear some of yours. So in honor of the channel starting, I want all of you to post your D&D stories in the comments. Tell me about your most clutch dice roll. When did the hands of fate go in your favor?